Hi everyone, I'm Claire Liu and I'm the CEO of Know Your Team, and I'm thrilled today to have a really special guest. I have Mollie Duffy, who is the co-author of this incredible book that is called No Hard Feelings, The Secret Power of Embracing Emotions at Work. And I read it in one sitting, it was that good, and not to mention beautifully illustrated by Liz Fosslien, her co-author. And we'll get into what the book's about, but I really wanted to have Mollie on The Heartbeat because this topic of emotions and leadership, I think, are inextricable, for better and for worse. So wanting to hear from Mollie herself. Not only is she an author, but she is an organizational designer at IDEO and has taught at Stanford and written for publications like Fast Company. So excited to have you on The Heartbeat today, Mollie.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Cool. Okay, so Mollie, I know you've watched a few of these interviews, and the way that they go is I always start off by asking everyone the same question, which is, what's something you wish you would have learned earlier as a leader?
So for me, I wish I would have learned how to be a little bit more vulnerable as a leader. I'm somebody who tends towards being an under-emoter. So we talk in the book about those people who are over-emoters and under-emoters. And under-emoters tend to be a little bit more reserved. They think before they speak, which is a good thing, but also means that sometimes we can bury our feelings. Over-emoters wear their emotions on their sleeves. They're the people you go to if you want someone to get really excited with you. But they can also sometimes share emotions and then have regret about sharing those emotions if they aren't fully processed. So knowing this tendency, one of the ways we talk about that people can get their teams to trust them is to be a little bit more authentic and vulnerable. And that was something I had to learn as a leader to do. I've led teams, and especially with clients, to do things like ask for help and to say when I'm overwhelmed, and to share some of those emotions that before I would just sort of put deep inside myself.
Definitely. I think it's, first of all, kind of amazing that you know that that's what you are. Because I think a lot of leaders who are listening to this or watching this might have just heard your description of an under-emoter and gone, oh, that's kind of me. But that term, under-emoter, isn't, I don't know, it's not kind of popular lexicon. So I'm curious for you, how did you find out that that's what you were? Was it in the research as you were doing the book? Was it something that happened much earlier in your career? Did someone tell you?
Yeah. So I had never heard those terms before writing the book, and that was something that came up in our research, was those terms. And I think once I heard the definitions of them, that under-emoter one really resonated with me because I have heard that in feedback. So the words that are often used to describe me are, you're very professional, you're calm, you're reserved. I'm very friendly, but I'm not going to be the person who you're going to come to if you want me to get really excited about something. I'm going to be the person that you come to if you need to calmly talk something through, and I will be good for that. And there's not one, it's not right or wrong. We need both in the workplace. And I think once you people hear the descriptions, I think probably if you've gotten feedback over the years, you're able to say which side you are. And of course, there's a spectrum, and many people are probably somewhere in the middle. My husband is definitely an over-emoter, and so I have someone who I live with who I can go to get really excited, and I know what he's like, and so that's my sort of mental model for what that side of it is.
Definitely. I can only imagine for folks who do identify as being an under-emoter. This is what I'm thinking as you were saying that. I was like, I actually think that's kind of a good thing. Like being calm, being reserved. I'm going to be presumptuous here and say perhaps it's helpful in decision making. Perhaps it's helpful in moments of complexity. What would you say to someone who would argue that vulnerability of one, either actually leaning into something that you might not naturally be predisposed to, which is emoting more, and two, actually talking about the things you're not good at. I mean, couldn't those things backfire, hypothetically?
Absolutely, yeah. So in the book, we write about this idea of being selectively vulnerable. So as a leader, you definitely don't want to be overly vulnerable. Leaders have to think harder and longer than the rest of us about when to show emotion, because we are all looking for them for what is the right emotional norm in this organization? How much emotion do we show? And so we're studying the way that they display their emotion or don't display their emotion. You do want to have some vulnerability, so we're really good at picking up on fakeness, especially in our leaders. And so if you don't, as a leader, show any emotion, it's really hard to trust that leader. So a great example is, like, let's say something happened in a organization, like there was layoffs or you didn't get around to funding. If you, as a leader, get up in front of the organization, do not draft, say, I'm feeling frustrated or sad as well. People are going to be like, this thing happened, and you're a human, and you're not sharing how you're feeling about it, so either you're lying about it or you're not having those emotions, and either way, like, I don't know if I can trust you anymore. So you want to share that, but you also don't want to share too much, because that is where you can seem weak. So the leaders who share too many personal stories, that can undermine your authority, and people can start to question your ability to do your job. So we talk about you have to be vulnerable but selective about it. You also have to provide a path forward. So to go back to the example I gave of the layoff, you have to say, here's how I'm feeling, but I trust that we're going to get through this, and here's the things that I suggest we do in the next 6 months to get through this.
Right. I think I remember reading this section of the book, and I took actually a ton of notes on it, because I think it's really hard to do.
Yeah.
So what I mean on a few levels. One, being vulnerable in general is just difficult, and it's so interesting that this topic of vulnerability is something that came through in your research in the book, because it's actually something that's come through in our research. We did a survey with almost 600 employees and managers this past fall, asking them what they believed was the number one most effective way to build trust in an organization, and they actually said it was showing vulnerability. So just doing that in general, it's powerful, but it's hard, especially if you're not naturally predisposed to it, especially if you don't emote, especially if weakness is a potential undesired ramification that you project in being too vulnerable. So one, that's just hard. And then two, okay, now you're saying I have to be selectively vulnerable. I have to know in what situations, in what context, to what extent, timing, right? I agree. I'm curious for folks listening. What advice would you say, Mollie, from the research or from different leaders that you've talked to or from your own experience? Like, how do you draw that line? Like, how do you know? How do you know when to be selectively vulnerable?
Yeah. So it's a great question. Yes, we make it sound so easy. Obviously, it's not for me either in my work life.
Yeah.
But so it's the decision shouldn't happen like if you're sitting there and then you decide, okay, I'm going to be selectively vulnerable in this moment. It probably is going to take a little more time and thought before you do that. So when you're feeling emotions, the best leaders are able to hit a pause button and say, instead of immediately sharing, either being totally vulnerable, selectively vulnerable, saying, what am I feeling and what's the need behind that emotion? So you might be feeling, suddenly you're like just so annoyed with the team. And you might be able to then take a step back and figure out in the next hours or come back the next day and say, okay, why am I feeling annoyed? I'm feeling annoyed because I have anxiety about us meeting our deadline for this client. And the team isn't working in the way that I would want them to meet the deadline. So you can come back and say, here's how I'm feeling. I'm feeling anxious about getting to meet deadlines. I personally am somebody where as closer the deadline comes, the more stress I get. And so what can we do to put in place that we can get the work done on time? The other thing is, I think, understanding that it's okay to have emotions and negative emotions as a boss. So often we think we're only allowed to share positive emotions, but totally okay to have a bad day as a boss. So we talk about it in the book. We spoke with Kim Scott, who wrote the book Radical Candor, which I love, and she said, it's okay to say to your team, I'm having a bad day. The reason I'm sharing this with you is that it has nothing to do with you, but I don't want to make your days worse, my bad day. So I'm sharing this emotion so that I'm being fully transparent, so that I'm not going to have these emotions go viral towards you.
Absolutely. I think it almost sounds like, and you touch on this in the book, that it's a mixture of self-awareness, first and foremost. So knowing, I am actually having a bad day. Like there's something that's non-work related or maybe work related that's causing me to feel anxiety or to just feel off. So that's self-awareness. And then two is the self-reflection. One thing I love that you talked about in the book is this idea of emotional fluency, and this idea to sort of see the landscape of how you're feeling, and then the capacity to productively channel that in a way that is healthy. And I love that concept. So it's not denying the fact that you're feeling a certain way, not overcompensating, but this mixture of both awareness and reflection. So I think, thank you so much for sharing that, Mollie. One other thing that I was curious about is you talk a lot about, in the book, this idea of creating psychological safety as a leader, right? So on one hand, you have to be vulnerable and selectively vulnerable as to not scare people away or overburden them, but then also to help other people in a team feel vulnerable as well. And psychological safety, it's a term coined by Amy Edmondson, and it's something that's gained a lot of traction and popularity in the past few years. And it's something with Know Your Team. Obviously, we work really hard with our software and with our workshops to teach leaders this. But I want to talk about it in the context of emotions. Like, why is it important to help employees feel this way?
Yeah, it's such a great concept, and we had heard about it. Google did the study around it. It was back in 2012, and it came up in the context of emotions because it's really what psychological safety is at its core is a feeling. It's an emotion, which is that I feel safe when I suggest ideas or I admit mistakes or I take risks. And I'm not fearful of being embarrassed by the group. And so a lot of times one of the emotions that can actually be so detrimental to teams is fear. When you're not feeling safe and you are feeling fear, you're not going to share all of your ideas and you're not going to bring everything that you have to that team. So the study was, I think it said that people who don't have psychological safety are more likely to leave their jobs, so higher turnover. They bring in less revenue. They're not as effective. And so it's this emotion that's actually really like it goes deep. Like fear is like one of the most base primal emotions that we have.
Totally.
And the body and the brain just naturally shut down when we are fearing.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say how both powerful and prevalent fears in the workplace, because one, we don't often think I'm scared when I'm at work. Right. Hopefully, most people don't feel that way, but it's so true. We asked a question through Know Your Team to thousands of managers, and we ask, is there anything that you're afraid of at work? And the majority of people say yes. I forget the exact percentage, but it was more than 50%. I believe close to 60% say, yes, I'm actually scared of something at work. And fear, not only does it prevent you from speaking up, but it prevents innovation, right? It prevents people from taking risks. It prevents people from doing what they think is actually in the best interest of customers because they're worried about internal repercussions. It's even how they treat certain team members because they're scared of how they might be perceived or how they might that might, be reflected outward. You did mention some recommendations in the book, but I love, if you don't mind, chatting through some of them on how you get rid of that fear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first of all, I love that you asked that as a survey question. I've never heard that before. And
really?
Yeah, I'm so curious. I mean, we can share it later, but I'm so curious what the common buckets were that people were afraid of.
Totally.
But yeah. So what you can do, so you can set team agreements. This is like
I love that idea you mentioned.
Yeah. That I recommend is how do you want to treat each other? What's some example ones we talk about in the book are assume good. So assuming that your team members want to help you and want to collaborate, being present. So a lot of times we can get on our devices and not speak to each other as humans. But taking the time before you start a project or when you're working with a new team to create a list of ground rules, and you can keep adding to that as you go, is super important.
Definitely. Well, as you were writing this book, Mollie, I mean, the number of different studies and articles and research and people that you've talked to are aplenty. Was there something that you wish you could have touched more on, maybe particularly in regards to leadership that you found, but for, whether it was editors or length or just time that you weren't able to delve into? Anything, you felt like you wish, folks could hear?
Yeah. So I think I'm super interested in workplace culture, and I would imagine the listeners, reviewers are as well. So there's a lot more that I think I would have loved to cover. We do have a chapter about that, but
and you're an organizational designer. I mean, this is sort of your bread and butter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
But I think we dove a little bit into emotion norms, and that is something that I think we don't talk enough about, and I wanted to talk more about. So
what are emotion norms? Go for it.
Yeah, so I had been aware of like cultural norms, and that's in an organization it's sort of like the way we do things around here. That's my favorite definition of culture. Yes. It's just like, how do things get done? And emotion, so an emotional culture is how much is it okay to express emotions in this organization? And it really differs by organization. So for example, like on a trading floor, it's totally okay to yell and scream and get angry. Whereas in many offices, that's not okay. If you're a doctor, you learn how to suppress a lot of your emotions because you have to be professional in front of patients if you're delivering bad news.
Yes.
In any job, it's not going to be okay probably to like sigh really loudly and bang your head on the table during a boring meeting.
Typically.
Even if those are the emotions that you're feeling at the time.
Right.
So how do we pick up on these? They're these emotion norms, which are these small actions that are these repeated social signals, and we oftentimes pick up on them without realizing it. So if you are complaining to a colleague and gossip is really encouraged and expressing sort of distaste with the organization is really discouraged, and you're complaining to the colleague, that colleague may sort of nod in agreement and ask you to continue and share some of her own pieces of negativity, or not, and you'll get the picture, like this is a more positive work environment. So there's not one is right or wrong, but in general, we think that organizations that have compassion and gratitude that are displayed as emotions are much healthier. And so most organizations could probably shift towards a little bit more emotional expression. Most organizations...
Fascinating.
It is interesting.
So you're saying that just sort of by and large, based on the research that you were doing, that we as teams skew towards establishing emotional norms intentionally and unintentionally to sort of hold back, and that it's actually shown to be better if those sort of warmer emotions are shown of compassion and gratitude. How do you do that?
Yeah. So,
in your opinion, yeah.
Yeah.
And based off your work, yeah.
Part of it is thinking about what's obviously going to work in your culture. So what I say, may or may not work in your organization. But I think it's all about communicating that emotions are okay. So we write this example in the book. There's this guy who works for the UK government's digital service. Giles is his name. And he wasn't high up in the organization, but he created a poster that's called an It's Okay To poster. And so he put it up and has all these examples of things that it's okay to do. And especially for new people in an organization, you're like, I don't know what's allowed here or not allowed. So some of the things that he said was, it's okay to introduce yourself. It's okay to not know everything. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to have a snack. It's okay to work how you like to work. Just sort of giving permission for some of these things, which I loved. Another example we talk about is at the Ritz-Carlton, they have this thing called the 10-5 way, which is where they train their staff to do this. And so you can train your staff to do this. This is obviously in a hospitality setting, but even in a larger organization. I've suggested this at my workplace. The rule is, if you walk within 10 feet of someone, you need to make eye contact and smile at that person. And if you walk within 5 feet of that person, you need to say hello. And so often in offices, it's like we stop acknowledging other people as human. And so then we're making chances for compassion and gratitude because we're walking down the hallway, we're not even recognizing them. We're in the kitchen together, we're not saying hello. So I've tried to encourage this in my own workplace, and it seems to be going well. I think more people are saying hello to me now.
Well, first of all, I find it, and this is maybe the both the con and pro of working at a small company. I'm shocked that people don't say hello in an office. I mean, much less to say, when I'm walking around on the street, I don't know, maybe being, I was born in Georgia and lived most of my life in the Midwest, I sort of expect that there's that cordial exchange. But what I really appreciate about what you're describing, Mollie, is the specificity to which the desired behavior that you want to see about emotional expression being determined, discussed, and codified by a leader. You're saying, write it out. Figure out what are the things you tangibly want to see different. Write out what's actually permissible and okay to do, and that action of codifying it actually makes it okay. And for better or for worse, be as explicit about people's interactions and how emotionally expressive they should be in just greeting one another. It's almost like when we and you are the organizational design expert here, but when you're thinking about building your team, designing an organization, it's almost like you're creating a handbook for a society, right? For a country. It's like, how do you greet one another? How do you show gratitude and compassion? Like, to what extent? And you actually talked about this. There's a great book, I forget who wrote it, but Aaron Meyer, who did the culture map, right? And talking about how different countries have obviously different modes of cultural expression. You talk to an American who says something is fine, and that doesn't mean it's fine. You talk to a German who says it's fine, and that definitely means that they're fine. So you take that cultural context and you think about that even in teams, and how we need to be as explicit perhaps about what is okay, what is not, and to what degree of emotion we can share.
Yes, I love that you brought that up. It's one of my favorite books, The Culture Map by Aaron Meyer. And I think it's so often we think, it's just between countries, but working at one place, moving to another organization can feel like going to a different country sometimes. We have such different emotional and cultural norms at each organization. And then within organizations, we are working with people who come from lots of different cultures and have really different backgrounds. And so the emotional norms that they're used to or grew up with or bringing to the organization may or may not be the same. And so it's not that we all need to conform, but just, I think, as you said it, like, leaders very much set the tone. And so if you feel strongly that you want your employees to display compassion and gratitude and sometimes frustration if they're feeling that, I think just being really open about that and doing it yourself, but also, as you said, codifying, like just being really explicit that that's okay here, because a lot of times your employees may not assume that it is.
Definitely. Wow. Well, I feel like I could keep talking to you for hours, Mollie, but I guess for last parting question here, for leaders who have always struggled with emotions, maybe they're an under-emoter, maybe they've gotten feedback that they flip out too much, right, and they're on the other side of the spectrum, what advice would you have for them in either thinking about their emotions, framing their emotions, improving on that spectrum of sort of that inner life as a manager?
Yeah, for the overemoters, you said?
Both. Just folks
who
struggle with emotions. Yeah. Because I think it's on sort of every part of the spectrum.
Yeah. It is, I think, first of all, just knowing that it is going to be a constant struggle. It's never going to be something that I think you'll have to stop thinking about, like suddenly you'll just get it. Something that you can definitely get better with practice, though. So I think finding people who you trust to give you feedback on, like if you are more of an under or more of an outer, so getting a sense of that, like figuring yourself out first, making time to prioritize yourself. So if you're a manager or a leader, you can't be an emotionally healthy person if you're not taking the time to deal with your own emotions. So figuring that sort of thing out. And then I think finding somebody who maybe is outside of the organization, a mentor, a peer, a coach, to sort of practice with. If you're going to have an emotional conversation or make an emotional announcement or share something like that, it's super helpful to be able to just say, like, here's what I'm planning on saying, let me talk this through with you, how would you respond, what am I missing?
I love that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we don't often, we think we should be able to figure it out alone, but, like, I will often either do that with my husband or somebody who I don't work with, or I'll write it down. Like, if I'm going to be having a difficult conversation or need to share some emotions, I will, like, write it down in my notes document and sort of figure it out first. That helps me think about how to frame the emotions, the need behind the emotions, and what am I really trying to get out of this conversation,
right,
or what message am I trying to lead with? Yeah,
definitely. It's, I feel like our conversation's coming back full circle. It comes back to that acute self-awareness, because that requires a lot of willingness to confront the things that don't always feel good, the things that you don't always like to hear, your deficiencies, your unintended ways you come across to people. So it requires a very courageous amount of looking at yourself in the mirror, flaws and all, warts and all, and then it requires the discipline to set aside the time to analyze it, to get other opinions, to write it out. I think that advice is so valuable. It's something that I actually try as much as I can to practice personally, because you can't improve your thinking and your processes as a manager without taking a step back to look at it, and writing it down helps give you that perspective to see and to understand how it can be better. So thank you so much for sharing that advice. Thank you, for all the wisdom you've shared, and for writing this fantastic book. It's been out for I think just a month, and already gotten rave reviews on Amazon and folks like Susan Cain, and I've enjoyed it. And I know that Mollie, you and Liz also have a really fun Instagram with some really cool illustration that Liz puts out every other day, and a great newsletter as well. So if anybody wants to check that out, you definitely should. So Mollie, thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you for having me. Great conversation.